In this video, I'll introduce you to Playwright, which lets you run end-to-end tests on your site by emulating the browser. I'll cover all the basics you need to get started, and keep watching until the end of the video for some useful debugging features like this UI. Hey guys, and welcome to Azul Coding. To get started, I've set up a basic 2-page website containing a home page with a contact form and an about page with some text and an image. There's also a navigation menu in place that we'll be testing, and if we take a look at the mobile view, it opens up through a hamburger menu like this. Finally, we've got some styles and a script that will manage the navigation menu and deal with error handling on the contact form. We're calling a contact endpoint here, which doesn't actually exist, so we'll add some Playwright mocks to return a sample response. All the code, including the tests that we'll be writing, is available from the link in the description down below. So let's start by writing our first test. To get started, we'll first need to install Playwright. If you've got Node.js installed, you can go ahead and execute this command, npm init playwright. This will then take you through some steps to install all the dependencies. We can choose TypeScript or JavaScript, specify the folder the tests are in, and for now we'll specify the default option to the next two questions. This will then install all the browsers, etc., and add in some config files. It's set up the config file for us here, so feel free to look through the documentation and see if you want to use any of these properties. But for now, let's look at a simplified version. One useful property to include is a base URL, so when you navigate to pages in the test, you can provide a relative URL, so there's no need to repeat the domain name. We can also specify a headless property. By default, the tests will run in the background, but if you want to see the browser for debugging purposes, set this to false. Next is a web server config. Add this in if you want Playwright to run your site before executing the tests. And lastly, the projects array is where you can specify the browsers you want to run against. We'll just be using Chromium today, but feel free to add in WebKit or Firefox, and take a look through this devices list if you want a mobile specification. Now we're set up, let's start writing some tests. I've created a test file and given it the extension spec.ts, and then I've imported test and expect from Playwright. We can then create a test by calling test, passing in a name, and a callback function with the page parameter, which refers to the current browser page. For this test, we'll first need to navigate to the home page, and we can do that by calling page.goto, passing in the relative URL, thanks to our base URL that we provided in the config. And now that's done, we're going to check the title of the page, and we can do that by calling expect, passing in our page parameter, and then we can perform a check on the page by choosing one of these functions. I'll use to have title, and specify the correct title being Azul Coding. So as you can see, the syntax is fairly intuitive. We're declaring the test with a name, and when the test runs, it'll execute this code. And in this case, we'll navigate to the home page, and then we expect the page to have the title Azul Coding. So let's run the test using npx playwright test and see what we get. And there we are, the test passed. But let's see what happens if the title doesn't match. I'll delete the word coding and run it again. And now we get an error message, and it clearly highlights the difference between the expected output and the actual one. Let's also check the title on the About page now, and I could simply copy and paste this test and make a few changes, but there's a cleaner way of laying this all out. I'm going to be creating a few more tests so we can easily get messy and badly organised. So firstly, we can group tests together using test.describe like this. Similarly to before, we can specify a name for the group and add all the tests in the callback function. Let's run this and see how it looks. And now you can see it's added the group names in the output. You might have noticed that we're navigating to each page in the test itself, and so if we had multiple tests, we'd be repeating this line all over the place. Luckily, we can use test.beforeEach at the top of each describe, and specify the code you want to execute before each test runs. This is also useful for resetting anything that one of these tests might change. For example, if we navigate to a different page in a test, this might have a knock-on effect on subsequent tests. We can also use before all if we want to execute code once before all tests run, and similarly we can use after each and after all. That works in a similar way once the tests are completed. Let's move on and take a look at locators and form handling now. We'll often want to query the page and identify and interact with elements. In JavaScript we'd use the document query selector, but in Playwright we refer to elements via locators. Let's see it in action with a new test that navigates from the home page to the About page using the navigation menu. There's a range of helper functions that can find elements on a page. Here are some examples: get by label, get by test ID, or get by text. We'll use the latter one to find the About menu item. We can then click on that like so. By default, this will wait for any navigation to occur before executing the next line of code. To verify that we're on the About page, we can use expect again to say we expect the page to have the correct URL. We can pass in a regex value here to avoid having to write the full URL with the domain, etc. We can add in an additional check to see if the heading is correct. We can select the heading element using page.locator this time, which allows us to add any CSS query we like. And then we can perform a check on this element using a wide range of helper functions. The full list is here and includes to have class, to have ID, etc. But we'll use to contain text and check that the right text is there. Let's add a similar test for the about page to see if the navigation works over there as well, and then run the test. Now that works, let's test if the contact form works as expected. Looking at the site, the contact form takes in a couple of field inputs and manages error handling through JavaScript. I'll start by adding a test to check for a successful form submission. Because we don't have an API endpoint in this implementation, we can go ahead and mock a response. This is useful when we want to mimic how an API behaves without having to directly call it. We can do this using page.root, specifying the endpoint, and a callback function that will be executed when the endpoint is called. In this case, we want to return a response, and we can do that with root.fulfill, specifying the status and sample JSON body. Now the root endpoint is mocked, let's start by clicking on the submit button as I did earlier in the UI. When this happens, the error messages for the required fields, name and email, should be visible. Intuitively, we can use page.locator again with the toBeVisible function. Then let's fill in all the fields, and we can simply use the fill function to do this. And once that's done, we'll click the submit button again. At this point, the success message should be visible. Let's then copy this text and change it so it checks how the site handles a server error on the API endpoint. We'll modify the response in the mock, after which we'll expect the error message should be visible this time. Let's run the test. And there we are, they've both passed. Let's test if our website is responsive and accessible next. In addition to functional end-to-end testing that we've covered, we might also want to perform non-functional tests, such as checking if the site works well on smaller screens and with screen readers. Let's add in a responsive design test first. That will check if the mobile menu works as expected. Because we'll need a smaller viewport size, we can explicitly set this using the page.setViewportSize function with the width and height. We'll then navigate to the home page and check if the mobile menu button is visible as intended. And lastly, when we click on the mobile menu button, we then expect the menu items to be shown. Now we'll want to run this test, but I don't want to run all the tests, just this one. We can do that by adding on only here to become test.only. And we can do a similar thing with describe.only to only run a particular group of tests. Let's see if it works. And there we are, the test passed and it was the only one that ran. But if you want to be extra sure that the viewport size was correctly changed, we can save a screenshot with this line of code. And if I run the test again and open the screenshot, you can see the size is correct and the menu items are visible. Let's write a test for accessibility now. We'll want to check if each page has only one h1 tag, and we can do that using a count function. On the About page we have this image here, and so we want to check if it has an alt attribute. We can use the locator again and loop through all the images there might be on a page. We'll use a for loop to do this, making sure to call the all function on the locator, which will return an array of image elements. We can then say we expect the image to have attribute alt set to something with a short regex here. Let's run this test with test.only again. And there we are, that all works. Now we've learned the basics, let's finish off by looking at some bonus debugging features. Firstly, we have a VS Code extension that makes running tests easier. As you can see, I've added in these buttons beside each test, and if we click on one, we can easily run a particular test and get the output below. We can also make use of this testing tab on the left, which lists all the tests grouped appropriately. There's also a HTML reporter built into Playwright. We can turn this on by setting reporter to HTML in the config file. I'll intentionally cause one of the tests to fail to see what it looks like in the report, and then when I run the test, it shows a failed test as expected. But if I run npx playwright show report, it'll open this HTML file that clearly shows which tests pass and which ones failed. I can then go into the failed test and see the steps that failed in a clearer way than I would in the console. The last bonus feature is the best of them all, and that's the Playwright UI mode. If we add the UI argument when running Playwright, it'll bring up this interactive UI that allows us to not only run the tests and see the output, but also see what the site looks like at each step. Let's try and run the form submission one here. Now this test passed, and if I hover over each step on the left, you can see the error messages are being shown on the screen, then the fields are being filled in, and then finally we get the success message. We can clearly see each line of code and debug any issues in greater detail. That covers all the basics of Playwright. Of course, there are many more features to explore, so feel free to leave a comment and share any tips or questions you might have. If you're looking for some example apps, I've created a suite of desktop and Android apps that are all open source, and I've also made a language learning site built to 11T that's 100% free. Check them both out in the description down below. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to keep up to date with the latest from Azul Coding. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.